When I woke up, my phone was face down on the nightstand. That was the first thing I noticed. It wasn't the morning light slipping through the curtains, or the distinct quiet stillness of a Sunday morning in Boston. My phone was face down, exactly how I'd left it the night before, because I had made a conscious, deliberate choice to stop being available. I flipped it over. The screen lit up with 159 missed calls. For a long time, I didn't move. I just stared at the number. Then, I tapped open the single text message buried beneath the mountain of alerts and read it, word for word. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I need to talk to you. There are things about him you need to know. I tossed the phone onto the sheets next to me and sat up. My name is Eleanor Vance, and I am 52 years old. Before most people in my life even understood what I was trying to accomplish, I was already out in the world building something of my own. 18 years ago, I founded Vance Historic Restoration in a drafty South Boston basement. Back then, all I had was a single renovation contract in an old neighborhood and a business plan I had rewritten 14 times. Today, it stands as one of the premier commercial real estate and historic preservation firms in New England, handling major projects all along the East Coast. All of this was built before Richard ever entered the picture, before we bought that historic estate in Concord, Massachusetts, and before what happened 3 months ago. Before you hear anything else, and before you learn what I overheard at my own Thanksgiving dinner, you need to understand one thing. Last Thanksgiving, in my dining room, I sat at a long table I had personally decorated. Back then, I was still naive enough to believe that holiday traditions could actually hold things together. Richard sat at the head of the table. He was quiet, carrying a specific kind of stillness he'd had for weeks. It wasn't the quiet of a man at peace. It was a carefully managed silence, the kind a man keeps when he is focusing all his energy on keeping one part of his life completely separate from another. I had noticed it, but I hadn't given it a name yet. His son Julian had too much to drink. I say that not to make an excuse for him, but to state a fact, and because the words that spilled out of him that night had clearly been simmering deep inside long before the alcohol loosened his tongue. He looked right across the table, staring straight at me, and said, "I'm not going to sugarcoat this because you don't deserve it. You're just a low-class intruder who pushed her way into our lives. That blue-collar dirt you can't wash off makes me sick, especially here at a Thanksgiving table in a house meant for our family's social standing. Did you honestly think a checkbook could buy you class?" I turned to look at Richard. I watched his face. I watched him reach for his glass of Macallan. He took a slow sip, set the glass back down, and stared right past my left shoulder into empty space, as if he hadn't heard a single word of his son humiliating me in a house I bought and paid for in full. He said absolutely nothing, no correction, no reprimand, not even my name. That silence told me a truth that 18 years of navigating the cutthroat business world could never have prepared me for. It wasn't the silence of a man caught off guard. It was the silence of a man who had already chosen his side and was simply waiting for the scene to end. I stood up. I went upstairs. I grabbed 2 suitcases from the closet and packed what I needed. Not everything, just enough. I didn't slam the door. I didn't say a word to either of them as I left. I drove to the Cambridge home of my oldest friend, Sarah, sat in her kitchen, and gave myself exactly 1 hour to process. Then I called Evelyn Croft. 3 months later, sitting in a Back Bay apartment, I stared at those 159 missed calls and the text message I had now read 4 times. I picked up my phone, typed out 2 words, and hit send. I know. The night I called Evelyn Croft, sitting at Sarah's kitchen table with a cup of hot tea I hadn't even touched, a strange clarity washed over me. It was so sudden and sharp it felt almost aggressive, because all the signs had been there the entire time. Every single detail was right in front of me. The most unsettling part wasn't that I had missed them, but that I had actually seen them, processed them, and filed them away under explanations that seemed perfectly reasonable at the time. This is what you have to understand before you ask why I didn't act sooner. About 14 months ago, Vance Restoration entered the largest expansion phase in its history. I was traveling every other week: Providence, Portland, New York, Philadelphia. I was closing massive contracts that would secure the company's future for the next 5 years. I was building. And when you are building at that scale, you have to operate on trust. You don't have a choice. You can't nurture a massive enterprise while auditing every single person within it. By then, Richard had been managing the day-to-day finances and purchasing operations for 3 years. He knew all the contractors, the agreements, and the personnel. When he began positioning himself as the primary contact for our material suppliers along the East Coast, I saw it as initiative. I saw a man stepping perfectly into the role I had given him. The suppliers loved him. Meetings went flawlessly. I had no reason to look beneath the surface of how smoothly everything was running. But I remember the first time something felt off, and how I talked myself out of it in less than a minute. It was a Tuesday evening during dinner. His phone was face down on the table. The only reason I noticed was because for the past 3 weeks, it had been face down every single time we ate. I remember thinking, he's being considerate. He knows how much I value our time together at the table. That was the narrative I chose to believe. I chose it because I had built our marriage on the assumption that the man sitting across from me deserved the benefit of the doubt. For 4 months, the phone stayed face down. And for 4 months, I kept believing that same story. Then came an executive meeting. Nothing dramatic happened, and that was the problem. One of our project coordinators mentioned that Richard had requested suppliers send certain assessments directly to him before copying the executive team. The explanation sounded reasonable enough. We were expanding. Communication lines were getting tangled. Having a centralized point of contact was a standard operational choice. I approved it without a second thought. Now I realize that information is never easier to manipulate than when people believe it is simply being organized. Next came the weekend trip to New York. He was attending an industry expo for historic building materials, or so he said. When he returned Sunday night, I asked the usual questions. How was the convention? Who did you meet? Anything useful? His answers were incredibly thorough, detailed enough to sound completely genuine, and so polished that I noticed the fluency and immediately dismissed it. When you aren't looking for a lie, a rehearsed answer sounds exactly like a confident one. There was no event badge, no business cards, and not a single name I recognized from the East Coast restoration community. I told myself he just wasn't the type to collect convention clutter. The warning sign I ignored most completely happened about a month and a half before Thanksgiving. A supplier's name appeared on a payment authorization form that Richard had pre-approved before it hit my desk. It was a name I didn't know at all. I asked him about it. He told me it was a new environmental assessment firm they were onboarding, and that it was just moving through the internal system. The paperwork was lagging a bit, but it was nothing to worry about. His tone was casual and supportive, exactly how a manager sounds when they are taking care of the small details so you don't have to stress. I thanked him and moved on. That moment played back in my mind countless times later on. So, on that Thanksgiving night, sitting in Sarah's kitchen, the full picture of those 14 months finally came together. The face-down phone, the New York trip, the unfamiliar supplier, and that confidence that was never actually about the business. I didn't call Richard. I didn't call my sister. I didn't sit around waiting. I called Evelyn Croft. Evelyn is one of the top commercial litigators in Boston. She specializes in corporate fraud, high-net-worth marital asset disputes, and the kind of financial asset tracing that requires knowing exactly where to dig and how to turn what you find into bulletproof evidence. She told me she would bring in a forensic accountant within the week, someone to go line by line through every transaction Vance Restoration had processed during the time Richard held operational control. She gave me strict instructions: touch nothing, change nothing, and say nothing. I told her I understood. What I didn't tell her was that I already suspected the name on that payment authorization was just the beginning. The forensic accountant Evelyn hired started with the payment authorizations. These things always start there, not with dramatic revelations or smoking guns, but with paperwork. It's the quiet, mundane paper trail built by a methodical mind over months, created by someone who believed no one would ever care enough to track it down. Within the first 2 weeks, 3 major things surfaced. First, there were substantial payments flowing to an entity that didn't even exist in Vance Restoration's approved vendor database. Second, there were contract authorizations bearing only Richard's signature. According to our internal regulations, any amount above a specific threshold strictly required my co-signature to be valid. Third, there was a pattern. This wasn't a series of random oversights. It was a calculated rhythm tied to specific months and specific project payout cycles. That kind of timing only exists when someone knows the company's financial calendar inside out and knows exactly how to operate within the blind spots. Evelyn called me at the end of the second week. She used a word she hadn't used before: deliberate. I sat with that word for 2 days before returning her call. It was during those 2 days that Marcus Rhodes reached out to me. 12 years. By the time I walked out of my own house with those 2 suitcases, Marcus had been with Vance Restoration for 12 years. He joined us as a field superintendent back when we took on our very first large-scale municipal preservation project, and he eventually became the backbone of our operations. He was the man who knew where every subcontract was filed, who signed what, which contractor relationships were built on solid rock, and which ones were just enough to get through a single season. Through 3 industry downturns and a financial crisis, he never once brought a problem to my attention without also bringing a solution. His text message was brief. "Can we talk privately?" I called him back within the hour. He asked if we could meet somewhere quiet, away from the office. We met at an old-school diner in South Boston on a Tuesday morning. He was already seated when I arrived, a manila folder resting on the table in front of him, his hands wrapped tightly around a coffee mug. He looked like someone who had been carrying a heavy weight for far too long and had finally decided he couldn't carry it alone anymore. We ordered. We exchanged brief, cautious pleasantries, the kind of conversation 2 people have when they respect each other too much to fake comfort. Then I looked at the folder, and then at him. Without saying a word, he slid it across the table. I opened it. The first document was a payment authorization. The vendor name at the top read, Sterling Preservation Consulting. I had never seen that name on any piece of paper, any approved vendor list, or any contract correspondence at Vance Restoration. Nothing. The authorization was dated 11 months prior. The signature at the bottom belonged to Richard. The line for my signature was completely blank. I flipped to the next page. Another authorization. The same vendor, a different amount, the same missing co-signature. I closed the folder. Only then did Marcus speak, his eyes fixed on his coffee mug. He told me that 3 months before I left, he had personally pointed out an accounting irregularity to Richard. Richard had given him the exact same explanation. It was a new environmental assessment firm, still moving through the onboarding pipeline, nothing to worry about. He believed Richard for 3 weeks, then the next authorization appeared, then another. He began quietly printing the documents and taking them home for safekeeping because he didn't know who else Richard had compromised within the company. He didn't know who was watching him. He wasn't ready to make an unprovable accusation that could turn around and end his career. He was protecting his livelihood. He was also protecting me. When he finally looked up, I could see that both things were true, and that they had cost him an equal amount of sleep. I placed my hand flat on the folder. I told him he had done the right thing. What I didn't tell him was that Sterling wasn't just a supplier's name. I had encountered it somewhere else entirely. Evelyn laid out the documents on the conference table in a very specific order. Not alphabetical, not chronological, but in order of severity. I didn't need anyone to point that out to me. When you build a business from scratch, you know exactly how a calculating mind prioritizes information. The forensic accountant had been incredibly thorough. Sterling Preservation Consulting LLC, registered in Delaware but operating in Massachusetts. The sole registered agent, Chloe Sterling. Date of incorporation. 14 months ago, exactly 3 months after Richard and I came back from our anniversary trip to Nantucket. I remembered that trip. I remembered thinking how relaxed he seemed that weekend, more than he had in months. Now I understood what that relaxation actually was. The name hit me before I even processed the rest of the information. Not because I knew Chloe Sterling personally, but because I had heard it before. Once was at a charity gala a 1.5 years ago. Richard had mentioned it casually when I asked who had put us in touch with a notoriously difficult municipal zoning official. He seemed unusually pleased with the connection at the time. It wasn't anything worth remembering then, just a passing name in a 30-second conversation. Then it happened again a few months later while we were watching television. A text message flashed across his phone screen. Chloe. No last name, just Chloe. I remembered asking if it was work-related. He said it was. I never thought about it again. And then I remembered something else. An end-of-year company party the previous winter. A woman was standing near the bar talking to Richard while I was wrapping up a conversation with our largest steel supplier. There were no inappropriate gestures, no dramatic moments, just a distinct air of familiarity. When you trust the person you are married to, that kind of familiarity barely registers. I walked across the room a few minutes later, and she was gone. At the time, I never even asked who she was. Now I found myself knowing the answer before Evelyn even pushed the registration papers across the table. Now I was looking at a name tied to an LLC that had quietly drained hundreds of thousands of dollars from the hard-earned contracts my company had secured. Evelyn walked me through the entire structure, taking her time. Richard wasn't just skimming. I want to be precise about that distinction because it matters. Skimming is opportunistic. What Richard had built was a deliberate infrastructure. He took the funding from 3 major renovation projects Vance Restoration was executing along the East Coast and quietly rerouted the payments meant for environmental compliance and historic documentation through Sterling Preservation Consulting as a middleman. On paper, Sterling appeared to be a vendor providing legitimate services. In reality, it was just a collection entity. The money went in, and Richard pocketed the proceeds as personal income. The actual construction work kept moving forward, so on the surface no alarms went off. The existing subcontractors in our network simply received slightly less money through adjusted invoices that Richard controlled. No one complained because the discrepancies were small enough to be absorbed into the standard contingencies of a project budget. 11 months, 34 separate transactions, totaling $340,000. He used his operational authority as a tool. He used the access I gave him as a doorway. He used the trust I extended to him as the reason why nobody looked twice at his single signature on those authorizations. Evelyn let me sit with that number for a moment before continuing. Then she told me about Arthur Pendleton. Pendleton is a divorce attorney who runs a highly reputable mid-sized firm in Boston, specializing in handling marital asset disputes for high-net-worth individuals who want to establish their legal position quietly before anything becomes public knowledge. Evelyn knew his name from the Boston legal community, the way lawyers know each other, not through personal friendship, but through reputation and the cases that circulate in specific circles. Richard had met with Pendleton, a preliminary consultation regarding his legal options in the event of a divorce. What concerned Evelyn wasn't the meeting itself. People have a right to seek counsel. That is their privilege. What concerned her was that Chloe Sterling had been present for at least one of those consultations, not as a client, but as a participant. And whatever Chloe witnessed in that room was not protected by attorney-client privilege, which extended to Richard alone. Evelyn spelled it out clearly. Richard wasn't waiting for me to make a move. He was already building his position. He was doing it while I was still sleeping in that house. I looked at the documents spread across the table. The LLC registration, the transaction logs, the timelines arranged in neat columns. They were so clean and precise that if you didn't know what you were looking at, they almost looked like a piece of art to be admired. A feeling settled inside me, something I hadn't felt since Thanksgiving. It wasn't anger. Anger had come and gone 3 months ago in Sarah's kitchen. This was something colder and far more useful. It was a feeling I recognized from the early days of building Vance Restoration, when a critical contract fell through or a partner proved unreliable, and I had to sit across from the wreckage and decide not whether to move forward, but exactly how to strike back. Richard hadn't caught me off guard. He had simply exposed himself on a timeline of his own making. Now, that timeline belonged to me. I told Evelyn to prepare everything. She asked me how far I wanted to take this. I answered her without a single second of hesitation. When I arrived, he was already there, sitting at a corner table near the window. His hands were wrapped around a glass of water he hadn't touched, carrying a distinct stiffness that comes from rehearsing what you want to say for so long that the words no longer feel real. He looked both under 23 and much older than 23. It was a specific quality that only comes from living with the consequences of your choices for months. The water wasn't the only untouched thing. There was a plate in front of him with half a sandwich already cold and a receipt folded into quarters. It was the look of a person who had ordered lunch because sitting at a table without ordering felt strange, and then found themselves completely unable to swallow a bite. I noticed all of this before I even sat down. I also noticed that he didn't look me in the eye once. Not at first, and not out of anger, but out of shame. There is a difference. I ordered a coffee. I sat down. I didn't smile, and I didn't scowl. I didn't let him read a single thing on my face because I hadn't decided how I felt yet. That was the truth. I had driven to this Brookline tavern in a state of careful neutrality, and I intended to keep it that way until I understood why I was sitting across from my stepson, for the first time since he told me across my own dining table that I carried the cheap stench of the working class. He spoke first, he said, "Eleanor," just my name like a door being pushed open. Then he told me that all those missed calls had been him. He said he knew what it looked like and that he wasn't calling to ask me for anything, but only hoped I would let him finish what he had to say. The "he" in the text message was Richard. Something had happened, and he believed I needed to know. He was incredibly cautious when he said that last part, like a young man realizing he was handing over something he could never take back. I told him to go ahead. He told me that 3 weeks after I walked out, Chloe moved into the house. Not gradually, but completely. Her belongings, her presence, her taking the seat at the head of the dining table I had paid for. Richard hadn't consulted Julian, hadn't asked him, but simply showed up with her and a moving truck one Friday afternoon with an attitude that made it very clear this living arrangement was a done deal. The second month, Julian's allowance and trust fund disbursements were cut off entirely, without a single word of explanation. 1 week the money was there, and the next it was gone. Julian tried calling Richard 3 times about it. Richard only answered once, telling him cold and flat that he needed to learn financial independence. He delivered the line with that distinctive, practiced smoothness, the tone of a man who is already emotionally detached from a relationship and is just waiting for the other person to catch up. Then came the house. Richard told Julian that the living arrangements were about to change. Not immediately, but soon. Soon was a word carrying the heavy lifting for a conversation Richard clearly didn't have the stomach to actually hold. Julian had to clear out to make room for Chloe's art consulting studio. At a certain point, Julian stopped talking. It wasn't because he was finished, but because he seemed to lose his train of thought. His eyes dropped to the table for a brief second. When he spoke again, his voice was much quieter. He told me he completely understood if I didn't believe him. He understood if I never wanted to speak to him again. Then, he kept right on talking without waiting for my reassurance. I valued that more than any apology. He wasn't begging for forgiveness. He was just continuing to lay out the facts. Then he leaned forward slightly, his tone shifting. He told me about the meetings. Casual business conversations on weekend afternoons right there in the living room with men he didn't recognize. But the moment Julian walked past, the talking would stop dead. At first, he assumed it was standard business. Richard always had business to handle. But the abrupt silence felt wrong. It was that distinct shift in the air that happens when someone enters a room they aren't supposed to be in. One man in particular had visited 3 times over the course of 2 months, driving a dark gray Audi, carrying a high-end custom leather briefcase. It was the same one every single time. Julian had seen him shaking hands with Richard at the door, and the way they interacted, the ease of it, made it clear this was no ordinary vendor meeting. Then, one afternoon, the door to Richard's study was left ajar. As Julian walked down the hallway, he saw documents spread across the desk. He didn't stop, but before Richard's hand reached out to pull the door shut, he caught a glimpse of part of a company name on the top sheet. Sterling. I kept my expression completely unreadable. When we stood up to leave, I looked him right in the eye and delivered the one sentence I had firmly decided on before walking through the door. The person I am angry at is no longer you. Before he could answer, I walked away. Some statements carry the most weight when you don't leave any room for a reply. I hadn't even driven out of Brookline before I called Evelyn from the car. I didn't mention Julian's name at first, nor did I explain the meeting. I simply gave her the facts as I knew them. She listened the way all truly excellent attorneys listen, without interrupting, without reacting, holding a specific kind of silence. It meant every single word was being accurately and permanently filed away. The man with the leather briefcase, the dark gray Audi, 3 visits to the Concord house in 2 months. The same briefcase every time, slipping in quietly and leaving even more quietly. A man comfortable enough with the arrangement to keep coming back. That meant he wasn't an outsider being recruited. He was already inside the infrastructure Richard had built. Evelyn said she would cross-reference that description with the employee directories of the contracting partners, whose payments had been rerouted to Sterling Preservation Consulting. I told her that if Richard's neighborhood had an HOA camera system, and the Concord properties absolutely did, we might be able to trace the vehicle registration through the visitor logs. She told me she would handle it. She called me back within 48 hours. Not with vague speculation, but with a solid chain of evidence. The main entrance to the neighborhood was indeed monitored by cameras. The footage wasn't perfect, but it was clear enough to establish dates and exact times of entry. The 3 visits lined up perfectly with the weekends Julian had described. The exact same dark gray Audi appeared every single time. From there, Evelyn's investigator began narrowing down the possibilities the slow way. Vehicle registrations, visitor patterns, payroll records from contracting partners, and individuals tied to the specific firms that had already flagged in our forensic audit. Most names were eliminated quickly. The dates didn't line up, the cars didn't match, or the job titles made no sense. Only one name survived every single round of screening: a mid-level operations liaison for a regional building materials auditing firm, the exact firm whose East Coast contracts were among the very first to be rerouted under Sterling's name. The registration matched, the visit dates matched, and phone records later obtained through legal discovery showed his device pinging in that exact location during 2 of those 3 visits. His position at the firm put him in the perfect spot to facilitate exactly what the forensic accountant had been trying to pin down. This wasn't just money being redirected. Someone on the receiving end was actively smoothing out the ledgers to keep internal alarms from triggering. The paper trail showed the movement of funds. The people trail showed the intent. Evelyn now had both. She used a word she hadn't used since our very first conversation. Solid. I took a moment to sit with that word. It deserved the respect. Then I got to work. Because that is the rule when you build a business from nothing. You learn very early on that information without action is just awareness. And awareness alone never protected anything. I had spent 18 years learning to make decisions under pressure, with incomplete data, my instincts sharpened by every misstep along the way. This was no different. On Richard's end, the net was closing. But what lingered in my mind wasn't the Audi or the investigators, or even the confirmation that someone outside the company was helping him. What I couldn't shake was that these meetings were happening in the house I bought, in rooms where I paid the utility bills, around the table where I used to serve dinner. It was happening while I was sleeping right next to him, believing we were building a future together. That was the part that stayed with me, not just the fraud but the sheer violation of the access I had given him. I needed to make absolutely sure everything on my side was completely immovable before any of this went public. I started with the accounts. Any joint holdings established during our marriage. I separated my personal finances cleanly and decisively, with Evelyn ensuring every single movement of funds was fully documented and completely undeniable. It wasn't about hiding assets, it was about building a record. There is a massive legal distinction between the two, and I knew it well. I wasn't transferring wealth, I was establishing with absolute clarity, via a paper trail, what belonged solely to me, what was held jointly, and what that distinction meant under Massachusetts law. Then came the ownership documents for Vance Restoration. Evelyn and I spent 2 full meetings meticulously reviewing the company's corporate filing history, the original articles of organization, the ownership percentages, and the dates. Vance Restoration was incorporated 18 years ago, 7 full years before Richard Ellsworth ever appeared anywhere in my life. That fact stood on its own. What we were doing now was making it ironclad. We fortified the written record so thoroughly that any future claim Richard tried to attach to the business would have absolutely nowhere to land. He had his architects, now I had mine. What I didn't tell Evelyn, and what I have never told anyone else, is that later the evening I met with Julian, I drove past that house in Concord. I didn't slow down or make it obvious. I just passed by at a normal speed in a vehicle Richard had never seen me drive because I had bought it 3 weeks after moving out. The lights in the front hallway were on. Parked by the curb was a dark gray Audi. I didn't stop. I kept driving. I didn't feel any dramatic rush of emotion over what I had just confirmed. I simply added it to the puzzle of things I already knew, and I kept moving forward. That was the only direction that mattered now. I had everything. That is the exact flavor of a situation nobody ever warns you about. The specific torment of holding every single piece of leverage you need, only to be told you have to sit on your hands. The forensic records were clean and certified. The LLC was traced and locked down. The witness intelligence from Julian connected the paper trail to a living, breathing person who could be cross-examined. The corporate structure of Vance Restoration was fortified beyond reproach. Evelyn had everything she needed to file the complaint, and I had everything I needed to look Richard Ellsworth in the eye and watch the exact moment he realized he had crossed the wrong woman. But Evelyn told me to wait. She delivered the advice the way she always did, unvarnished, leaving no room to soften the blow. She explained that filing before Richard fully committed to his legal position would simply give his counsel room to reshape their narrative, She wanted his attorney, Pendleton, locked into a set strategy before we blindsided them. A defense lawyer caught flat-footed during the discovery phase makes mistakes a prepared one never would. We needed Richard comfortable enough to show his entire hand before we made our move. I told her I understood. Then I drove to Sarah's place. She was in her kitchen, just like every Thursday night. Something was simmering on the stove, the news was playing at a low murmur, and the house carried that distinct, grounded atmosphere of a woman who had built a life on her own terms. It was a place where hard truths could always be spoken. I sat at her kitchen counter and walked her through everything. She didn't interrupt, she just listened quietly. When I finished, she sat in the silence for a moment before looking up. "Don't move yet," she said. I looked at her, waiting for an explanation. She clarified that she wasn't asking me to practice patience. Patience, she noted, was too often a performative virtue society expected from women, while men completed their wreckage. She wanted me to wait because she had lived in this exact structure before, not my specific circumstances, but her own version years ago. A man completely convinced he was managing a woman he had underestimated from the very beginning, making decision after decision based on that false confidence until those very choices ruined him. She told me that the most dangerous thing I could do right now was step in before Richard had fully committed to his mistakes. A man who thinks he's miles ahead never looks back to see what's catching up to him, she said. Richard was operating under the assumption that my silence was a sign of grief. He thought my absence from the office meant I was retreating. He truly believed the woman he had exploited and humiliated had simply found a quiet corner to nurse the wounds he left behind. She leaned forward slightly. Let him keep thinking that. I thought about her words for a long time on the drive home. She was right, with the kind of absolute clarity that only comes when you've personally paid the price for the lesson. A part of me wanted to file the paperwork immediately, not for strategy, but for the sheer relief of it, for the satisfaction of watching his phone light up with a notification he never saw coming. But satisfaction wasn't the goal. Impeccable execution was. My objective was to build a case so tightly constructed that the moment Attorney Pendleton opened the response, he would realize there was absolutely no scenario where his client walked away intact. Richard's text arrived on a Wednesday evening. "Eleanor, I think we need to talk about the business. There are things that need to be handled, and I'd prefer we resolve this privately between us before it gets complicated. Let me know when you're free." I read it twice. Then I set the phone face down on the marble kitchen island and went back to fixing my dinner. He sent that message firmly believing I was hiding somewhere, heartbroken. He was convinced that my silence over the past few weeks was the paralysis of a defeated woman who had run out of options. He looked at everything I had built and decided that the only version of me that mattered was the one who sat at that Thanksgiving table, waiting for him to speak. He never once considered the fact that I had already struck back. I just hadn't done it to his face. 10 days of complete silence followed. I didn't reply to his text, and he didn't send a second one. That gap told me everything. A man who truly wants to resolve a legitimate business matter follows up within 48 hours. The fact that he didn't mean he had already handed his next move over to someone else. Evelyn called me on a Thursday morning to let me know that Attorney Pendleton had made contact. Before she even finished her first sentence, I sat up straight. Pendleton had sent a formal legal demand. Richard was asserting an ownership interest in Vance Restoration. His position was that his operational contributions during the marriage had significantly increased the value of the enterprise, and that this appreciation constituted a marital asset subject to equitable distribution under Massachusetts law. His argument relied heavily on the claim that he had used his high society connections to bring key contractors and prestige to the firm. He wasn't asking for a conversation. He was making a legal claim on a company I had established 7 full years before I ever met him. I listened to Evelyn read the key legal phrasing without saying a word. When she finished, I asked how she planned to respond. She told me she had already drafted the reply. From the day he stepped into his role, Richard was a salaried employee of Vance Restoration, compensated well above the market rate. He had signed an employment agreement that explicitly classified him as an operational executive, not a partner, not an equity participant, and not a shareholder in any capacity. The work he did for the company during our marriage was a paid job. Every hour, every meeting, every supplier call had been compensated in full. Under Massachusetts law, a premarital business remains the separate property of the founder unless the non-owning spouse makes uncompensated contributions that directly and provably increase its value. Richard hadn't worked for free. He worked for a salary that I set and approved. Evelyn's letter was only 2 paragraphs long. It closed every single door Pendleton was trying to open, leaving no ambiguous language for them to twist. "Send it," I told her. Then I sat there with the phone in my hand for a moment. It wasn't the legal technicalities that struck me, it was the sheer audacity. This was the man who sat across from me at Thanksgiving, the man who said absolutely nothing while his son insulted my background at my own table, the man who watched me walk out of the house I bought with 2 suitcases and didn't lift a finger to stop me, the man who moved another woman into that same house weeks later. And now, he wanted the company. Not just the marriage, not just the real estate. He wanted the enterprise that represented everything I had built. It wasn't just the legal claim itself that revealed his character. Claims fail every day. It was the profound, entitled arrogance behind it. Then, Evelyn told me there was something else. The forensic accountant had gone deeper. They hadn't stopped at tracing the timeline of Sterling Preservation Consulting. What surfaced in that deeper audit completely reordered my understanding of when this had actually started. 14 months before Sterling was even incorporated, long before Chloe Sterling appeared anywhere in this picture, Richard had already begun using ghost vendors to submit fraudulent billings against Vance Restoration's project budgets. The amounts were small, which was exactly why they were so precise. Scattered figures, irregular intervals, slightly inflated costs for lumber and masonry materials. Nothing that would trigger an automatic alert or catch the eye of anyone doing a standard review. It was a patient, methodical drain over 14 months that yielded an additional $180,000. He was doing this before she ever entered his life. I want you to understand what that means. The relationship, the LLC, the rerouted contracts, I had looked at all of it as connected. I thought a man had found someone else and built an exit strategy around her. But this second layer of fraud predated everything. This wasn't an exit strategy. It was simply a reflection of who Richard Ellsworth was before he was useful to me, while he was useful to me, and after he decided I was no longer needed. The total amount identified across both layers of fraud now stood at roughly $680,000. 25 months, 2 different mechanisms, 1 consistent intent. Suddenly, something about that Thanksgiving dinner became entirely clear. It wasn't what Julian said. It was the silence. For months, I had looked at that silence as a decision made in a split second. Now, I wasn't so sure. A man who can quietly take money from you for 25 months can keep quiet through almost anything. Evelyn asked me how I was doing. I told her to send over the full forensic report. I read it that night at my kitchen table. Every page, every transaction, every date. I read it the way I used to read my very first historic restoration contracts when I was 34 years old. Slowly, completely, skipping nothing. When I finished, I closed the folder and sat in the quiet of the Back Bay apartment. I felt something settling in my chest that wasn't grief and it wasn't anger. It was readiness. A complete, structural, absolute readiness. And Richard Ellsworth had no idea what was coming for him. Evelyn filed all the litigation paperwork on a Monday. I knew the schedule inside out. Before it was bound and submitted, I had approved every document, verified every exhibit, and confirmed every single figure in the forensic report. The divorce petition, the fraud claims, the 2-layer forensic audit packaged as evidence exhibits, and an injunction freezing the assets of Sterling Preservation Consulting pending a full investigation. I knew the contents of that filing as well as I knew the articles of organization for my own firm. I had read it from front to back, and nothing in it was left to chance. On Tuesday morning, I woke up and made coffee. It wasn't a performative display of calmness. I was genuinely at peace. There is a specific distinction most people never get to experience. The difference between trying to stay calm and actually arriving at stillness. I had been preparing for this Tuesday for 3 months and 2 weeks. There was nothing left to defend against. Everything that needed to be done had been done. Every fact that needed to be documented was recorded. All that remained was the ordinary passage of time, and I intended to live in it without a single ounce of guilt. I called Marcus at 9 a.m. We spent 30 minutes discussing a new commercial restoration contract he was tracking in the South End. Legitimate work. The exact kind of project Vance Restoration was built to handle. Acquired through the right channels, managed through the proper process. Marcus had the preliminary budget numbers ready, and they were excellent. I told him to move to the next phase. He said he'd have a full proposal ready by the weekend. I didn't mention what was happening at the Concord house, and he didn't ask. At 9:47 a.m., a process server knocked on the front door of the property I own in Concord, Massachusetts. Richard Ellsworth answered it. Chloe Sterling was somewhere inside that house at the time. I don't know which room she was in or what she was doing. I don't know her exact location within a space where she had never paid a single dollar of the mortgage. All I know is she was there. And among the legal documents handed to Richard at that door was a summons that included her name, her LLC registration, and a forensic accounting ledger documenting every single dollar that had moved through the entity registered in her name over the past 11 months. I wasn't there to see his face. I didn't need to be. At 11:15 a.m., I drove over to Cambridge and parked on the street outside the restaurant Sarah and I had been going to for 15 years. The hostess knew our names and sat us at our usual table by the side window without asking any questions. Sarah was already there, a glass of water waiting in front of her. The look on her face told me she knew exactly what today was, and she had decided that sharing a quiet lunch was the only proper way to mark it. We talked about her neighbor's new fence, which had apparently crossed the property line by 3 inches and become a source of immense neighborhood tension. We talked about an architectural history documentary she had watched over the weekend. We talked about the recent inconsistency of the restaurant's Boston cream pie, agreeing that the dip in quality warranted a polite word to the manager. At 11:47 a.m., my phone lit up on the white tablecloth between us. A text message from Evelyn, just 4 words. Service has been executed. Then came a second message, even shorter than the first. His attorney called within 15 minutes. I stared at the screen for a moment, not out of surprise but out of validation. People who are genuinely prepared for a legal battle rarely call their lawyer 15 minutes after opening a complaint. Truly prepared people call their attorney before the server even knocks on the door. I picked up the phone, turned it face down on the tablecloth, and looked across at Sarah. She was watching me with a quiet, grounded gaze, the kind that only comes from a friend who has walked a long road with you, who knows exactly when to speak and when to simply offer her presence. I picked up my fork and we finished our lunch. Julian called me on Tuesday night at 8:14 p.m. I remember the exact time because I had just set my phone down on the kitchen island and stepped away. When you know a device is about to ring, and you need a brief moment to catch your breath before it does, you intentionally put that kind of physical distance between yourself and the noise. Shuju tracking showed me that Richard would make a move after being served, but I didn't expect the fallout to hit Julian by 8 o'clock that very evening. I answered on the first ring. He didn't sound panicked the way a 23-year-old might. He sounded eerily quiet, carrying the careful restraint of someone who had already digested the worst-case scenario and was now simply reporting from the wreckage. He told me Richard had returned home mid-afternoon. The conversation was brief. Richard didn't raise his voice, and he didn't need to. Cold indifference achieves everything a shouting match does, but leaves fewer traces. Richard didn't ask Julian what he had told me. He didn't make any direct accusations. He simply laid out the new reality. He said his priorities had shifted. He said the direction of the property required certain operational adjustments, and Julian's continued presence complicated those adjustments in a way that was no longer manageable. It was polite, precise, and completely devastating. It was delivered with that specific kind of cruelty only a parent can inflict, not through overt anger, but through a calculated systematic indifference masked as a logical decision. To clear out enough creative space for Chloe's studio, Julian was the one who had to go. Julian packed a bag and left before dinner. I only asked him one question. I asked if he was safe. He said he was, sitting in his car in a Target parking lot off Massachusetts Avenue. It wasn't a permanent solution, but it was the only place he had to go for the night. I told him to stay exactly where he was. I called a furnished apartment complex in Somerville, where Evelyn had placed an emergency client the previous year. It was short-term, clean, well-managed, and the kind of establishment that didn't ask personal questions about your circumstances. It turned out they had a single vacancy. I gave them my credit card information over the phone, confirmed the lease would start the following morning, and prepaid for 2 weeks. Then I called Julian back and gave him the address. I didn't tell him where the money came from. I didn't explain the logistics, attach any conditions, or use the moment to comment on what his father had done, or what I was currently executing in court. I didn't ask what else he had seen or heard in that house. I didn't mention Evelyn's name, and I didn't mention the lawsuit. I asked if he had eaten. He said no. I told him there was a 24-hour diner 2 blocks away from the apartment that served excellent food, and that before he did anything else, he needed to go get a meal. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked, "Why are you doing this?" I told him because it was the right thing to do, and I have never needed a reason beyond that. He didn't answer right away. I could just hear his breathing on the other end of the line, sitting in a freezing Target parking lot with a single duffel bag in his backseat. The father he had trusted completely had just written him off with the cold efficiency of closing an inactive bank account. I thought about my Thanksgiving dining table. I thought about the words he had thrown at me, the silence that followed, and the long drive to Sarah's house. I thought about everything that had transpired between that evening and tonight. Those words still mattered. I want to be perfectly clear about that. Helping him did not mean forgetting what he said, nor did it mean immediate forgiveness. The hurt was real, and the damage was done. The work of understanding exactly what had happened at that table still belonged entirely to him. But none of that changed the immediate reality. A 23-year-old was sitting alone in a cold car because the father he trusted decided he was a liability. And then I thought about who I am. Not the version of me Richard defined, and not the one Julian repeated across the dining table. The real me is shaped by everything I have built, survived, and decided. And that woman does not leave a young person stranded in a parking lot. I wished him a good night, told him the apartment would be ready at 9 the next morning, and hung up. Then I went back to fixing my dinner as if it were any ordinary Tuesday. On the 11th day after service, a Friday morning, Evelyn called me. I was sitting at my desk in the Back Bay apartment, reviewing a contract draft Marcus had sent over. Evelyn didn't open with pleasantries. She never does. She simply said, "We have movement." I set my pen down. Chloe Sterling had hired her own legal counsel. I didn't respond immediately, letting the information cool down before addressing it. Evelyn walked me through the situation cleanly, keeping her personal commentary completely out of it. Chloe had watched a process server drag her name into a massive lawsuit. The filing included a frozen LLC, a certified forensic audit, and a corporate fraud claim targeting her as the registered agent of an entity used to divert $680,000. She wasn't the mastermind behind the scheme, but her name was the legal vehicle for the funds, and any independent attorney she consulted would have told her the exact same thing. Doing nothing was a straight path to absolute ruin. With the fraudulent consulting fees involving unreported federal income, she was also facing immense exposure with the IRS. Within 72 hours of being served, she had secured representation. At first, she wasn't cooperative, which actually surprised me. Evelyn noted that Chloe's lawyer initially handled the matter with extreme caution, requesting files, asking clarifying questions, and offering limited documentation. It was the standard behavior of an attorney trying to figure out if their own client was being lied to by the people around her. Then, the turning point came. She began cooperating fully, and not just with the bare minimum. Evelyn told me Chloe's attorney moved incredibly fast once they reviewed the full scope of our complaint. They moved fast because of one critical fact Chloe hadn't fully grasped until an independent legal advisor sat her down and explained the risk line by line. Sterling Preservation Consulting was in her name, not Richard's. The registration, the banking access, the corporate records, all of it belonged to her. The paper trail Richard had constructed moved entirely through an entity that legally tied back to Chloe Sterling. If federal investigators started pulling on those threads, she would be the one facing the legal fallout alone. Evelyn told me that almost immediately following that meeting, Chloe handed over her text message logs. Those records painted a picture that was far sharper than the one Richard had clearly drawn for her. Richard had repeatedly described Sterling as a routine consulting arrangement, temporary, administrative, and standard practice. What he hadn't explained was how much legal and financial liability fell squarely on her shoulders. And what he never anticipated was that the moment an independent lawyer got involved, someone would explain that reality to her in absolute, unvarnished detail. According to the records Chloe provided, the relationship dissolved almost the moment the lawsuit was served. There were arguments and confrontations, with Chloe demanding explanations that Richard simply couldn't provide. At one point, Richard even suggested that since the LLC belonged to her, she was in a much better position to explain the transactions to the court than he was. Evelyn paused there, and the implication hit me instantly. Chloe had finally realized the defining truth of her situation. If the infrastructure collapsed, Richard intended to walk away clean. Whether she survived the fallout was completely negotiable to him. Once she understood that, cooperation stopped being a moral dilemma and became a matter of pure self-preservation. She provided full access to Sterling Preservation's accounts from the date of incorporation. She handed over communications, written agreements, and text exchanges between herself and Richard regarding the entity, the payouts, and the true nature of the operation. She also provided one more piece of evidence. Evelyn's tone became incredibly measured and precise as she described it, noting it was uniquely valuable. Chloe confirmed everything she had witnessed when she was present for Richard's consultations with attorney Pendleton regarding his pre-divorce strategy. Chloe had been right there in the room. She heard those conversations, and because she was a third party and not Pendleton's client, absolutely nothing she overheard was protected by attorney-client privilege. I asked Evelyn what Chloe's cooperation did to our timeline. Evelyn told me it accelerated everything. Then she told me about attorney Pendleton. Pendleton had just filed a formal motion to withdraw as Richard's counsel, citing an irreconcilable conflict of interest. He didn't have a direct conflict with the central fraud case, but his firm had previously handled a brief, unrelated personal matter for Chloe years prior. It had nothing to do with corporate fraud or the LLC, and it was small enough that it didn't pose an issue while Richard was his sole client. But the exact second Chloe became a cooperative witness whose interests ran directly counter to Richard's, that minor past connection instantly created a direct, unresolvable conflict. Pendleton had no choice. He filed his withdrawal paperwork and stepped away from the case entirely. With his defense strategy shattered and his primary witness turning over the ledger keys, Richard was left standing completely exposed in a framework of his own design. Was he attempting to secure new counsel, or had reality finally caught up with him? Richard had now lost his original attorney, the woman he had abandoned his marriage for, the woman he had cast aside his own son for, the woman he had shattered 18 years of my hard work and trust for. That woman was now sitting across from him with her own lawyer, armed with her own reasons to speak the truth. It wasn't because she cared about me. It wasn't because she had a sudden awakening of conscience. It was simply because Richard had ultimately treated her the exact same way he treated everyone else, as a disposable pawn in his game. Every document, every piece of communication, and every transaction that moved through Sterling Consulting was now safely in Evelyn's hands through legal discovery. Evelyn finished speaking and waited. I looked out the window at the Boston skyline. This was the city I had operated in for over 20 years, the city where I started from nothing with a single contract and a business plan I had rewritten 14 times. Richard had only entered this city because of me. He accessed its commercial infrastructure through my company, my network, and my name. He had used all of it to build an exit strategy designed to keep himself afloat long after he pushed me out of the frame. But he missed one critical variable. The people he used would eventually calculate their own risks, and when the pressure mounted, they would choose self-preservation over protecting him. Most people choose themselves when they are backed into a corner. I turned away from the window. I asked Evelyn what our next move was. She laid it out. I listened to every word without interrupting. When she finished, I asked 2 clarifying questions, verified the timeline, and told her to proceed. Then I went right back to the contract draft Marcus had sent, finishing my review before lunch. Evelyn told me I didn't actually have to attend the mediation in person. She delivered the advice with her usual lack of emotion, putting no pressure on me either way. The complaint had been filed. The evidence was assembled and submitted. The asset freeze remained in place. Chloe's full cooperation had sealed the chain of evidence so completely that Richard's new attorney would see the reality of the situation the moment he read the file. Evelyn possessed everything she needed. The mediation wouldn't produce a single piece of leverage she didn't already hold. I told her I was going anyway. She held the line in silence for a moment. Then she said she would accompany me and requested that I say absolutely nothing unless she approved it first. I told her I understood. The mediation office was in Back Bay, a neutral venue arranged by Richard's new counsel. I had never heard the man's name before this case. In our initial phone calls, his cautious, restrained tone told me everything I needed to know. He had read the file, and he knew exactly what kind of mess he had inherited. We sat across the conference table from one another. Evelyn was at my side. Richard sat opposite us, his lawyer to his left. I hadn't seen Richard Ellsworth in 4 full months. The man sitting across the table was no longer the person who stood at the head of my dining room, watching his son humiliate me while nonchalantly reaching for his drink. That man carried a specific kind of ease, a deep confidence that no matter whose name was on the deed, the room belonged to him. The man in front of me now was the wreckage left behind after a 4-month calculation collapsed. He was thinner, his movements were hesitant, and he carried a distinct stiffness. It was the stiffness of a person whose instincts had told him he was winning right up until reality delivered a crushing blow, leaving him completely unable to trust his own judgment. He glanced at me when I sat down. I looked right back, giving him absolutely nothing to read on my face. His lawyer put forward a settlement offer with professional composure, full restitution of all funds routed through Sterling Preservation Consulting. A structured written admission regarding the earlier ghost billing phase, characterizing those transactions as an administrative accounting error to be resolved civilly. In exchange, Eleanor Vance would withdraw the corporate fraud claims. The divorce proceedings would move forward as a standard, uncontested dissolution with no further litigation. Both parties would walk away clean. Then, Richard spoke the first words I had heard from him in 4 months. He said he knew things had gotten out of hand. Out of hand. Not dishonest, not deceitful, not a deliberate fraud, just out of hand. I watched him choose those words, and I realized something instantly. He still believed there was room to negotiate. Not for the marriage, or even for the basic decency that should exist between two people who shared a life. He was trying to negotiate for his reputation, his future, and an escape route from the consequences. Then his lawyer continued, Richard will retain a professional reference from Vance Restoration for future employment purposes. Hearing that last condition, something finally settled deep inside me, arriving with total clarity. A reference. After 25 months of systematic theft from a company built 7 years before he ever entered my life. After that Thanksgiving table. After casting Julian out into a Target parking lot. In the face of a forensic file Evelyn spent 3 months assembling line by line, he wanted a reference. That single detail revealed more about Richard Ellsworth than 4 years of marriage ever had. He still didn't understand what he had actually taken from me. In his mind, he was still framing this as a financial dispute between two people who simply made different choices. He had never acknowledged, not in this room, and not through any legal communication, that he took more than just money. He took my access, my trust, my name's connection to the firm, creating a shell of deception inside the very life I invited him to share. The lawyer finished speaking. The room fell completely quiet. Nobody moved. Then Richard looked straight at me. Not at Evelyn, and not at his attorney. He delivered a line I would play back in my mind many times later. I never thought you'd take it this far, he said. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't an assumption of responsibility. It was simply the disappointment of a man realizing the outcome hadn't shifted in his favor. And in that exact moment I stopped wondering if there was anything left worth listening to. I let the silence hang between us. Then, I thanked his attorney for his time. I stood up, took my bag, and walked out of the conference room without looking back at Richard once. Once outside, I called Sarah. He offered to give the money back, I said. What did you say? She asked. Nothing, I just walked out. She laughed. It wasn't a loud laugh, just the short, precise chuckle of a woman who had waited a long time to hear those exact words. I ordered my usual coffee at the cafe in Brookline, medium roast, black, sitting by the window if the table was open. It happened to be vacant. As I sat there, my phone lit up on the table next to my cup. It was 10:22 a.m. Evelyn's name appeared on the screen. I read the message through once, set the phone down, and looked out the window. It was an ordinary Tuesday morning in Boston, with typical traffic moving along the street. People were pulling in and out of parking spaces. A woman walking her dog stopped as it sniffed the base of a light pole. A delivery truck idled at the curb with its hazard lights flashing. The world kept moving, completely indifferent to the notification that had just arrived on my screen. The injunction was granted. Sterling Preservation Consulting was officially frozen. The $340,000 that moved through the entity over those 11 months was verified and subject to full civil recovery. Richard's marital ownership claim against Vance Restoration was reviewed by the court and dismissed entirely. Evelyn's message included one additional detail. Richard's counsel had attempted a final argument, claiming the company's growth during the marriage was inextricably linked to his operational involvement, pointing to records they claimed proved his strategic contributions went beyond standard employment. The court reviewed the employment agreement, the payroll records, the ownership documents, and the company history, then rejected the argument completely. The ruling established that a business established by a sole owner 7 years prior to a marriage, which compensated its operations manager at market rate throughout his employment, carries no legal basis for equitable distribution. The first layer of fraud involving the ghost billings was officially incorporated into the civil judgment. The total amount identified across both layers stood at $680,000. The vast majority was subject to recovery through civil procedures, and the structured repayment terms Evelyn was simultaneously finalizing. I sat there digesting the finality of it until the delivery truck pulled away from the curb outside. Then I left a tip on the table, picked up my keys, and walked out to my car. I didn't plan where I was going next. That is the absolute truth. I didn't make a call, consult anyone, or arrive at a deliberate decision. I simply found myself driving the route I had driven for 18 years. Moving through the city, that specific sequence of turns was etched so deeply into my muscle memory, I could have done it with my eyes closed. When I pulled into the parking lot of Vance Restoration, I sat in the car for a few minutes before stepping out. The building, with its old brick facade and exposed steel beams, looked exactly the same as it always had. That was the feeling that washed over me as I stood in the lot. It wasn't a rush of triumph, and it wasn't just relief. It was something quieter and far more permanent. This was the enterprise I built with my own hands. I had pieced it together out of a single old contract, a business plan rewritten 14 times, countless early mornings, and decisions made under intense pressure. It was the distinct resilience of a woman who decided that what she was creating was worth the effort it took to build it. Richard spent 25 months trying to hollow it out from the inside, but it was still standing. I got out of the car. I walked across the parking lot in the morning light. I stood in front of the main entrance for a moment, my hand resting on the handle, the glass feeling cool against my palm. I let myself fully absorb the weight of that moment, what it feels like to reclaim something when you were willing to lose it rather than compromise your own standards to keep it. Because when you compromise yourself just to hold on to something, you've already lost it anyway. I pushed the door open. Marcus was standing about 10 feet from the entrance. He knew I was coming. I don't know how he knew. I hadn't called ahead. But he stood there with the easy composure of a man who had kept something perfectly safe and was now ready to return it to its rightful owner. He didn't offer a long speech, and neither did I. He simply said, "Welcome back." I gave him a single nod. We walked inside together. I sat down at the desk that had always belonged to me, and I picked up the first contract document Marcus placed in front of me. There was work to do. There is always work to do. That is the one part nobody can ever take away. He had brewed coffee before I arrived. When I walked into the apartment, that detail stayed with me. It was a small but deliberate gesture from a young man who, despite everything that had happened, still had a core sense of decency that reminded him how to be a proper host. The furnished apartment was tidy, the kind of neatness that belongs to someone trying to prove to themselves that they are taking their life seriously. A night school textbook sat on the table, and a printed enrollment confirmation sheet was resting on the kitchen counter. It was placed out in the open. He hadn't hidden it, but it wasn't entirely for show either. He was building something. It was small, and it was just the beginning, but it was honest. He poured the coffee. We sat down, and he kept his eyes on his mug. I let him sit in that discomfort for a moment. It wasn't out of cruelty. I wasn't there to punish him. But certain silences rightfully belong to the person who created the need for the conversation in the first place. I had driven across Boston to say what needed to be heard in a fitting, quiet space. When I spoke, I didn't soften my opening. I told him exactly what his words had cost me. I didn't use vague language like hurt feelings. I gave him a concrete, unvarnished description of what it felt like to be called a working-class intruder in a house I bought, at a table I paid for, on a day meant for family. I told him what it felt like to have your background weaponized against you like a sin. Not because of your actions, and not because of anything you did or said, but simply because the permanent marks of where you came from were thrown in your face as a disgusting offense, by a boy I had provided for and treated with complete openness for 3 years. I told him about the sheer despair of turning to look at the man sitting at the head of the table, watching him reach for his glass of Macallan as if nothing was happening. While I spoke, Julian didn't move. His eyes remained fixed on his mug. To his credit, he had the decency not to look away. I respected that. A lesser version of him might have tried to interrupt, to offer an early apology or an excuse, gestures that are usually meant to relieve the speaker's own discomfort rather than actually absorb the message. He did neither. He just took it. When I finished the hardest part of what I had to say, I let the silence hang for a moment. Then I told him I understood what had been done to him. I made sure to define that distinction clearly before moving forward. It wasn't an excuse. I told him I understood the social conditioning that shaped him. I understood the specific way a man like Richard teaches his son to view certain women through a lens that only serves their own social class. I understood how a boy absorbs that worldview long before he has the capacity to question it, and how that view is tested and shattered when the world stops playing along. I wasn't absolving him of responsibility for his words. I was pointing out the framework so he could see it for what it truly was. It was no longer a mold he had to fit. It was just something planted inside him, and he now had the choice to dismantle it. When I said that, he looked up for the first time since I arrived. I told him I wasn't his enemy. I told him I wasn't going to vanish either. But what he chose to do with that information was entirely his own work to finish. I wasn't going to manage it for him, and I wasn't going to wait around on a timeline that catered to my own comfort. Then I finished my coffee and stood up. When I reached the doorway, he called my name. Just like in the Brookline Tavern, it was simply, "Eleanor," like a door being pushed open. I looked back at him. He said, "I know it doesn't fix anything, but I am sorry." I gave him a single nod and left. By early evening, I was driving home through the city with the radio turned off. I parked the car and went upstairs. Standing at the window of my Back Bay apartment, I watched the Boston skyline unfold in the darkness, turning into 10,000 glowing windows. I realized that something I had been carrying with me since Thanksgiving had been set down somewhere along the road between that furnished apartment and this window. I never picked it back up. The divorce settlement was officially finalized on a Thursday. When Evelyn called to confirm at 2 in the afternoon, I was reviewing a material supplier quote that Marcus needed before the end of the day. I thanked Evelyn. She said she would courier the final legal execution papers to the office. I told her that was fine, and then I went right back to the quote. Marcus needed it. The business wasn't going to pause for personal updates, and I have always preferred it that way. The civil judgment had been entered 2 weeks prior. Richard had agreed to a structured repayment schedule negotiated by Evelyn, which included a specific clause. Any breach of the timeline granted Eleanor the right to forward the entire file to the Suffolk County District Attorney's Office for criminal prosecution. Richard understood exactly what that meant. He didn't default. It wasn't because 25 months of systematic fraud had brought about a sudden awakening regarding his character. It was simply because he couldn't afford the alternative, and he was smart enough to know it. He left Boston during the 3rd week of October. He moved to Akron, Ohio, taking a mid-level property management position with a shopping mall development firm where nobody connected his name to any scandal. A smaller city, a lower salary, a fraction of the life he had established while he was a part of mine. Chloe didn't go with him. Whatever had existed between them couldn't survive the weight of what her cooperation cost him, or the exposure his actions brought upon her. They had simply used each other for different ends, and when those advantages disappeared, there was nothing left beneath the surface. He wakes up every morning in Akron in a life of his own making rather than one he tried to steal. That is his judgment. It fits him well. The $340,000 diverted through Sterling Preservation Consulting was substantially recovered through the civil judgment. The $180,000 from the ghost billing phase, the earlier quieter money that existed before Chloe, before the LLC, before the operation even had a name, was partially recovered through the order, with the remainder locked into a strict repayment plan. Evelyn structured it to ensure every single dollar carried an enforcement mechanism. No room was left for good faith. I reinvested a portion of the recovered funds directly back into Vance Restoration. Not all of it, but a targeted, deliberate amount. It funded a partial expansion into coastal Maine that we had prepared for 2 years ago, but lacked the liquid capital to execute cleanly. It also allowed us to hire a senior architectural historian whose onboarding I had delayed for 8 months due to timing. Those were the decisions of a woman building forward, not someone salvaging a loss. The two strategies feel entirely different, and I knew exactly which one I was executing. Sarah was still right where she always is. On Thursday nights, the stove is simmering and the news murmurs in the background. Some things don't change, and they shouldn't. Julian is sticking with his night courses and working a steady job at a local firm. He is establishing something small but honest. He calls once a month, brief, careful conversations. They are the phone calls of a young man who understands he is operating on borrowed time and doesn't want to waste it. I answer every single time. In November, he called and spent most of the time talking about a licensing exam he had just passed. Before hanging up, he went quiet. Then he said he was sorry, not as an excuse for his youth, and not because he was angry at the time. He was sorry for Thanksgiving Day. For what he said. I listened, then I told him I knew. Neither of us said anything more after that. Sometimes the shortest conversations carry the most weight. On the last Tuesday of October, Marcus was still at his desk. After everyone else had left for the evening, I stayed behind in the office. There was no specific reason for it. No dramatic occasion, no anniversary, and no milestone I was tracking. I stayed simply because I wanted to be there. I had been away from these walls for 4 months, and I hadn't entirely finished enjoying the simple fact of being back inside them. I sat at my desk in the quiet of our 18th year. I looked out at Boston as it stretched into the night, the skyline lighting up block by block as the darkness settled in. This was the city I came to at 34 with a single contract and a business plan I had rewritten 14 times. It was the sheer resilience of a woman who decided that what she was creating was worth whatever it cost her. In the face of everything done by the person I invited into my home, at my table, and into my business, I protected it. I kept it safe. Sitting in this office, I didn't feel a rush of triumph. I didn't perform gratitude or peace, or any of the things a woman is expected to display at the end of a difficult story, just to make the narrative feel complete. I just went back to work. I was simply a woman, sitting at her desk on a Tuesday evening, in the 18th year of a business she built from absolute nothing. And that was enough. It had always been enough.